record this. All right, we're starting to record, and I guess hopefully people will jump into the Zoom session as they want to. You'll have access to the lectures there. I am running my current lecture from home today, so you'll have to give me a little bit of grace. The semester starts very soon, and I need to kind of keep my house and my office a little bit separate as I prepare. So I'm running from home. I don't have all my sophisticated equipment. However, I do have audio equipment here where hopefully you can detect my audio and it's very clear. I'm sitting in front of an air condition machine right now. If anyone is hearing the air conditioner, I'm very sorry about that. Hopefully, my audio is able to filter that out. But I want to get started. Basically, I am today. We're lecturing about racial ideologies and the sociological theories of racism. I think this is an important topic because it is one that advances the discussion about racism, about bigotry, about prejudice, and how to have more goal-oriented, achievement-oriented discussions around race. So we're not just circling around the same concepts over and over and over again. More importantly, if you go to my Patreon, I am very much aware that as I'm recording this lecture, you might be listening on Instagram or you might just chime into the Zoom chat if you would like to, that you can see me over the slides. And so my body might be blocking some of the words. Just a friendly reminder that you have access to the slides on your own through PDF format in the Patreon. If you go to where it says Lecture 2 Resources, there's a PDF file that you can download and you can follow along that way so you're not so irritated that my body might be blocking some of the words on the slide. Let's go ahead and get started here. The first thing I want to talk about before we start diving into the topic of racism and the theories of racism and what they mean and how they discuss racism, how they examine it, is I am talking about racism through a scientific lens. Okay. And that scientific lens means that I am describing racism in the context of objective, empirical based observation, right? I'm not talking about racism in some kind of emotional sentiment. I'm not talking about just bigotry and prejudice and how it makes you feel. I am talking about the examination of racism in a scientifically meaningful context. And in that scientifically meaningful context, first of all, you need to understand what a scientific theory is. Okay. Now, in layperson terms, in common discourse, the word theory is often used to describe like a blind guess. It's just conjecture in a way. However, in science, that is not what a theory is. Okay. In science, a theory is a well substantiated explanation of phenomena that we cannot directly observe with our eyes. Okay. Now, that still doesn't make it conjecture. There are lots of things that are well substantiated that we cannot observe with our eyes. Gravity, for example, being one of them. And if you see um, one of the reels on Instagram that I have that kind of blew up where I'm talking about the theory of gravity. This is one of those examples. We cannot directly observe gravity with our bare eyes, yet we can observe its effects and its output are consistent. The same could be said for cell theory or atomic theory or the theory of general relativity, right? Is that these scientific theories, we know them. When we hear the word theory in conjunction with these other terms and phrases, we know automatically that those theories are well substantiated. Now, in science, the meaning of the word theory only carries the meaning that it is a well substantiated concept. It's not up for, well, it can be up for debate. You're welcome to try to refute the claims of these theories. However, they are so well substantiated and well supported that they're not a matter of debate anymore. And so I often like to just kind of summarize for the sake of simplicity that in science, once a concept gets elevated to the level of theory, it's not a matter of debate anymore. Okay. And so we have lots of evidence. We have direct and indirect observations. We have experiments. We have lots of reasoning. And there are properties about a scientific theory that make it, let's say, credible, right? The first property around a scientific theory is that it concerns what are testable claims or falsifiable claims. Those testable claims or falsifiable claims means that whatever the theory is claiming at any point in time, you are welcome to test it using some kind of scientifically meritorious method, right? And because that theory is based on evidence, it means that over time we are in constantly testing those theories, we are amassing an ever growing body of evidence, an ever growing body of knowledge about that concept, which would then lead us to develop predictive power. That if we can consistently observe that the effects of gravity never change and its output is constant through time, we can also then make a prediction without testing gravity for in the future. The next time that if I were to drop, I don't know, I don't know, I have this little AirTag here, Apple AirTag. If I drop this AirTag before I actually do, it's going to fall down. And I'm making that prediction based on the growing body of knowledge that I have about the concept of gravity before I even test it that allows me to then make those predictions. So in science, theory is not just a blind guess. It's not just conjecture. It's not your say versus my say. It's not my perspective versus your perspective. It's a matter of opinion, and maybe we just see things a different way. That's not, that theory is not to be treated that way when we're talking about it in a scientifically meaningful context. So when we get to social theories, there are lots of social theories. We have behavioral psychology theory, for example. We cannot directly observe the processes, the external triggers that stimulate some psychological process from which a person then must rationalize the stimulus they're receiving and then behave accordingly. However, there is a consistent body of knowledge in which we can meaningfully make predictions about the kinds of behaviors that people have and the psychological motivators for why. I love to use the example in my classes of if I pick somebody up, imagine for those of you who are listening or watching, if I picked you up like you were some kind of sim character or something from the game The Sims, and I dropped you right in front of a bear cave with a mama bear and her baby bears, what would your initial response be? It wouldn't probably be, oh, so cute, and oh, let me go and cuddle with them and see if I can pet one of the babies. You're probably going to get as far away as possible. And that's predictable. You can ask pretty much anybody if they were placed in the same circumstance, would they, what would they do? Would they embrace the circumstance or would they flee? And 9 times out of 10, they're going to tell you they would flee. Well, this is adding to the credibility of what we call behavioral psychology theory. In behavioral psychology theory, we are literally talking about the psychological processes that then motivate those behaviors. We also have socialization theory. For example, socialization theory is a process in which a person is raised in a particular cultural context. And like a Sims character, if I picked him up, let's say we have a person, let's say you, because I'm talking to English speaking people, I'm not talking to anybody else who doesn't speak English. Let's say you, this English speaking person who I am making the assumption grew up in American society. And like a Sims character, I picked you up and I plucked you and I put you in the middle of rural North Korea. Do you think you would be able to survive in the middle of rural North Korea? If you do not speak Korean, you probably would not be able to communicate effectively. You might be able to kind of vocalize your needs or articulate your needs a little bit, but it would be very awkward for you to simply articulate that you need help, that you need to find a way to get back home, and that you're navigating into that direction. Navigating there means that you are not socialized into that cultural context. You're socialized to the American one. Now, can we see the process of socialization? No, we cannot directly observe the process of socialization, yet we have a consistent body of knowledge that tells us that people are in fact undergoing a constant process of socialization And there is a growing body, there is a large body of evidence to substantiate that theory. Okay. So when we get to critical theory, which I will eventually be talking about critical race theory, critical theory here, we're discussing the ability to critically analyze the components of society, power dynamics, racial dynamics, gender dynamics, to critically examine how people are in social relationships with one another. Who has more power than whom? Why do they have more power? And how did they go about getting that power? So, when we are talking about critical race theory, for example, critical race theory is critically examining the social dynamics of race. And on that basis, then, it is making the assumption that we understand that race is social construct, right? We understand that race motivates patterns of human behavior. We can observe those patterns or those race-based patterns of human behavior in society, and that is informed by the cultural context. Now, all of those things being considered here, okay, that's critical race theory, critically examining the social components of race. And there are lots of racism theories, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I need you to understand before I even dive into this deep discussion about race theories here, is you have to understand that a theory is not conjecture. It isn't just a blind guess, and I'm not going to be talking to you about anything here as if it is just a blind guess. Okay? So, on the basis of racism theories, we understand then that we're looking at race, or racism rather, excuse me, in a scientifically meaningful context. We're examining the social dynamics of race, how it's embedded in societal structures, how those theories of racism help us to understand the systems and patterns that produce and sustain racial inequalities. Okay? Okay, so there are lots of examples that we can go to. The first example that I like to go to in my classes is home ownership rates. This is called a race pattern disparity. In this graph, what you're observing here is that there is no significant overlap in any racial group. What you're seeing here is the red is white, Hispanic is yellow, black is the black color that you see here, green is Asian, and then the navy blue is kind of like an average of all of these home ownership rates combined. But with exception to where Black people and Hispanic people overlap for only a minimal amount of time, there's absolutely no overlap in home ownership rates that we can see here. Excuse me. More importantly, these home ownership rates are also reflective of something that is very familiar and informed by history. Somehow, white people have higher home ownership rates than everyone else in the country, even higher than the national average, right? And so what we're describing here is called a race pattern disparity. Well, how does something like this get produced? Is it on accident? Is it that Black people and Hispanic people are they're just lazier and they don't want to work as hard? Or is it that what we're observing here is maybe there are other extrinsic causes for why this pattern is emerging? But let's not just look at home ownership rate. Let's look at racial wealth inequality. Now, when people hear the word wealth, they often think of money, and then they think, oh, it's just how much money is in your bank account. Well, it's not just about how much money is in your bank account. Wealth is actually a summation of your total assets minus your debts. It is the value of your house, the value of your car, the value of your financial investments, if you invest in the stock market, minus your liabilities. That's minus your debts, minus your the I don't know, your student loans, for example, minus your mortgage. Whatever that sum total is, that is what we're calling wealth. Okay. So now when we're looking at the racial wealth gap, for example, yes, I would like to acknowledge that this is not just a black and white issue, as this particular graph would possibly suggest, but this is data from Forbes, right? And what we're observing here is that any median household wealth, we're talking about on average, let's just assume for the sake of example, a three-person family. That three-person family has a higher amount of wealth than Black people and Hispanic people combined. That we're talking about the average wealth of a three-person single family who identifies as white being on average roughly $122,366 when compared to $1,633 for Latinos and $1,233 for average African Americans. So why is it that we see that whiteness not only has higher rates of home ownership, but also has significantly higher wealth across the country too? Okay. But don't just take my word for it with wealth. Let's talk about incarceration rates. This is data from, I believe this is the Bureau of Justice Statistics published in 2022. We're looking at racial disparities in incarceration rates, where we can see here that Black people, African Americans, have a significantly higher incarceration rate than white and Asian people combined. Same is said for American Indian and Alaska Natives, as well as Hispanics too. So we're seeing a pattern here. And that pattern is that with respect to the specific context, Black people, people of color, appear to be marginalized in home ownership, in wealth, in incarceration. And what's going on here? What do we see going on here? I want to show you one more graph here, and I think this one is interesting. It adds a little bit of a caveat. I would love it if somebody would ask me for an explanation of this particular graph here, uh, uh, because it doesn't completely reflect the same racial hierarchy that the last graphs did, and yet we're still observing a race pattern disparity. What you're looking at here is life expectancy at birth. These are rates of life expectancy at birth with regard to race. And overall, what we can see is that there are incremental increases in life expectancy at birth for each racial group, and yet we still have almost no overlap. We have Black people on the bottom on this orange line here, overlapping American Indian and Alaska Native. And then we have white people in the middle, kind of on the national average. And then slightly above white people, we have Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders. What is going on there? I have an explanation. For the sake of time, I would like to obviously get through the lecture. But if somebody in the Q&A portion wants to ask me about this, if you want to make a note about it and have me go back and say, hey, so what was this about and why do we see this pattern? I'd love to give you that answer. And I'll help you to tease it apart because you'll probably figure out what's going on here too. And yet what we observe here is that with exception to historically marginalized groups, there's no overlap here. Well, what's creating this phenomenon? One could hypothesize that what's happening here is stress. We could say in one sense that Black people, brown people, people of color have a history in the United States in which their life is contextualized by stress. And in the context of health outcomes, that's going to mean that that's going to increase their blood pressure, probably result or leading to the increased likelihood of chronic hypertension, right? But it's not just about imposing some kind of deleterious force on their cardiovascular health. We're also talking about wear and tear on their mental and emotional health and well-being too. That stress, the stress of being impoverished, the stress of navigating an unfair landscape is also imposing a kind of wear and tear on a person's body. And then you have physiologic stress too. And that physiologic stress all together in conjunction, you have stress imposed on cardiovascular health, you have stress imposed on mental and emotional well-being, you have stress imposed on physiologic markers or physiologic health. We're talking about imposing a kind of chronic health deterioration. And that health deterioration will result in marginal patterns of health outcomes. And as we observe in terms of life expectancy, historically marginalized people of color are going to have significantly poor health outcomes and therefore significantly shortened life expectancies when compared to perhaps those who have not experienced as much or as significant marginalization as Black and brown people have, right? So now altogether, We are observing a pattern where it doesn't matter if we look at life expectancy at birth, it doesn't matter if we're looking at wealth, it doesn't matter if we're looking at home ownership rates, it doesn't matter if we're looking at incarceration rates, and I could go on and on. It's not just these four, but the point is, no matter what we're looking at, we are seeing an interesting pattern. Is that there's almost no overlap for anybody who identifies with a single racial group, but then more importantly, where there's no overlap, Black people are always in the worst position. Brown people are always statistically in the worst position when compared to their white and Asian counterparts. What is going on here? If we had to take our collective assessment of all of these different graphs that we just observed here, and we had to figure out what is going on here, we might say that what we're observing is the oppression of minorities. What we're observing is racism. What's producing these outcomes is racism. And that's where we get into the theory of racism. Do you see how I have substantiated this theory with visible evidence, quantitative evidence? I'm not asking for conjecture. I'm not positing conjecture. I'm not appealing to your emotions. And for those of you who are already familiar, let's not pretend like you don't know. We know that there is an extensive history of marginalization of these groups that no matter what aspect of the quality of their lives that we're looking at, they're always in the worst position. So the theoretical explanation for these outcomes is racism. Is racism producing these patterns? Well, yes, the theory of racism would posit that yes. Somebody like Charlie Kirk would say no. Okay. So that leads us into discussing racism then, where when we're discussing racism, first of all, we need to have an objective understanding of the term. We need to agree on what racism means. And unfortunately, in current layperson discourse, and I would even go to some extent to say in the scientific discourse, in the academic discourse, the term has no objectively agreed upon meaning. And it's unfortunate that it has no objectively agreed upon meaning. So, for example, here's what I mean. I'll go to the most extreme example of somebody walks into the room and says, "Oh, hey, we gathered up a bunch of wetbacks and we're sending them back to their country because they're all illegal." A group of people who heard the phrase wetbacks, for example, might be insulted because they would go, "Hey, you're racist. That's racist." To which this other person might go, "No, that's not racist at all. I'm just describing what happened." And it means that their assessment here is subjective. What one person is calling racism, another person might not think is racist at all. More importantly, there's no consensus around the term race. Who gets to be black in a literal sense? Who gets to be white? It's kind of a blurred line. We know that race is not a biologically valid concept. So what does that imply when we're talking about racism then? Okay. So I'm going to start with what you know, what everybody knows, and then I'm going to advance your knowledge on this. By the time we get to the end of this lecture, I will hope that I have successfully matured your understanding of race and racism. But we'll start with a layperson understanding. Okay. A very basic internet search of the term racism and its meaning would be something along the lines of discrimination and prejudice or discriminatory practices on the basis of race. Indeed, when we look at a basic dictionary version, it would say something along the lines of racism encompasses both prejudice and discrimination. It is the practice of treating people differently on the basis of their race. Okay, so I kind of want to start with that definition. I want to work with that definition, but I want to explore how race and racism has been discussed in the past in a scientific way. Okay, conventional understandings of racism and the racism and the meaning of the term that I've just described in the last slide. There are some people that say, "Oh, well, racism is prejudice and power. Racism is power and prejudice, and people who are prejudiced and people who have power, when their prejudice is combined with their power, that is racism." In my personal opinion, I'm not saying the people who assert this are wrong. Okay. I just don't think that this is useful. For somebody like myself, I have an interest in being able to scientifically examine and model racism to such a degree that I can identify its weak points, disrupt and dismantle the systems of oppression that it produces, and then to prevent those things from coming out in the future again. And for something like prejudice plus power equals racism, that doesn't really help me to be able to develop a scientifically effective model. Because if I said here, prejudice plus power equals racism, well, then great. How do we get rid of the racism? Can we get rid of differential access to power? Well, no, somebody's going to have more power than other people. Can we get rid of prejudice? Well, no, because that's like preferential and subjective. For example, I hate grapefruit. I think red delicious apples are absolutely disgusting in my prejudice. Can you do that? No, you can't. So then, is this a useful blueprint or is this a useful framework for understanding how to get rid of racism? Absolutely not, in my opinion. I think this explanation has its use, it has its place, but I don't think for the purpose of being able to identify effective methods of intervention on the production of race pattern disparities, prejudice plus power is not useful. Okay. Then we have a more conventional understanding that would say that racism really is just kind of like prejudice, acts of prejudice or discrimination that then produce race pattern disparities. And in the production of those race pattern disparities, you have individual acts of racism, you have institutional racism, and then you have systemic racism, etc. And in my opinion, this is a slightly more useful understanding of racism than the prejudice plus power gimmick. But in my opinion, this is still not very useful because it's very limiting. If I showed you a theoretical model like this, that racism means prejudice and discrimination are producing race pattern disparities, then in this model here, I want you to come up with a fix. What's the solution? Well, then some people would say end racism. Okay, great, end it. Can you do that? Do we have any global examples anywhere in the world? All of the conflicts that we've observed, whether it's Israel versus Palestine, whether it's the Hutus versus the Tutsis, whether it's Japanese versus Koreans, whether it's the European colonizers versus the Native Americans, is there any example in the world that we can think of where there was once racism and then it disappeared? No, we don't have anything like that. Nowhere in the world. Racism is somehow ubiquitous in the world, but we have absolutely no examples anywhere where the racism has ended. So, in my opinion, this is also a theoretical model that is like limiting. I get why people are so beholden to seeing and understanding racism in this kind of way, but I don't think that is useful for being able to scientifically innovate on how we can disrupt the production of systemic oppression and systemic disadvantage on the basis of race. In this context, in my opinion, this is describing racial prejudice, not necessarily racism. But I'm going to work with this because I'm going to lead you right back to what I would advocate is a scientifically objective understanding of racism. Okay? I'm going to work with this understanding here of racism means that it is prejudice and discrimination producing race pattern disparities. You have individual racism theory. Okay? And with individual racism theory, it means that we are theorizing the ways that racism appears at the individual scale or at the individual level, for which we are literally talking about those like explicit, expressed hate and bigotry by specific kinds of individuals, those racial slurs that you hear, the ways that they make people feel emotionally and personally, right? We're talking about racism that is in fact expressed by individuals either through their attitudes, their beliefs, their actions, okay? And that tends to be widespread. In this triangle here, I'm going to be building out this triangle. So what you see here is that I am implying that racism at the individual level or at the individual scale is the most specific context for which we can observe racial discrimination. Now, it is still a theoretical concept, but at the individual level, there are lots of ways that we can directly observe racism. Okay. And it's going to be usually the most overt forms of observation are those bigoted, name calling, actively discriminating. We've got this new town in Arkansas where they want to be a whites only town, right? This is individual racism. There are other acts of individual racism for which we cannot directly observe. And that's where individual racism theory is relevant, where you can't directly observe a person's beliefs. You know that they have those beliefs. You know that their actions are motivated by their beliefs, but you cannot directly observe the beliefs themselves. Those beliefs still exist at the individual level, right? So this is where individual racism theory finds its credibility. And I don't think I really need to argue home this point that individual racism is something I need to like prove to you because there are in fact direct examples of it, right? For those of you who follow me, you know that I have been basically eating Charlie Kirk with my lecture clips, right? And I fully intend to continue eating this person in whatever ways I can until he literally disappears from a place of relevance. But I think that a person like Charlie Kirk is the best example of explicit individual level racism that we have. The only difference between like Charlie Kirk and the white supremacists of yesteryear is that Charlie Kirk says everything that a white supremacist says except the word nigger. That's the only thing he does not say, and to my knowledge, has never been recorded saying. Okay. Outside of that, you have what you can observe to be very conscious, deliberate, racist acts, statements, beliefs, hate speech, all kinds of things. But there are other examples in history in the US, not just of Charlie Kirk, but of other people who are using those slanderous terms, who do or who are very explicit about their feelings and their sentiments about others, right? Okay. So in that regard, we're talking about explicit verbal cues, non-verbal cues or behaviors that are also explicit, discriminatory actions. You know this. This is what we would conventionally call racism in modern society, right? Is the bigotry. It is the prejudice. And then there's also implicit bias too, where implicit bias describes those unconscious attitudes. We're talking about stereotypes that affect behavior. We're talking about implicit verbal cues or implicit nonverbal cues, right? These would be like racial microaggressions or like being nice about your racism in a way. Oh my God, you're so articulate. I didn't know black people could be so pretty. You're so pretty for a black girl, right? Excuse me, they mean well when they express these things, but under the surface, what's actually being articulated is some kind of visibly racialized sentiment. Right? And individual racism tends to have, well, all forms of racism, really. But at the individual level, anyway, it tends to have a social impact. And that social impact is that individual acts of racism, individual level beliefs of racism contribute to broader systems of inequality by reinforcing racial stereotypes and reinforcing racial inequality. That we believe in treating people differently and negatively on the basis of their race, that then produces differential racialized outcomes, right? Okay. And so to some extent, one could say that individual beliefs of racism, individualized actions of racism are often used as justification for systemic and institutional forms of racism, which I will be talking about right now. Okay. Um, just a step above individual racism, we also have institutional racism, where that institutional racism is describing racism within a given institution. And I'm talking about a singular institution. Um, it could be that singular institution could be in the context of healthcare. It could be in the context of education. It could be in the context of housing. It could be in the context of criminal justice. I am talking about an organization that exists on its own as an organization that is singularly responsible for the production of racial disadvantage on its own. Okay. And so within any organization, I'm just going to take one, for example, just for the sake of simplicity. We'll talk about criminal justice because that's the popular example. Okay. Let's talk about incarceration rates, the rates of conviction, because people love saying, "Oh, well, what's wrong with mass incarceration if in order for you to get imprisoned, all you have to do is commit a crime?" No, you don't. People can throw hollow charges, and you can be found guilty on those hollow charges where there wasn't substantial evidence, and then you find yourself in prison, and you find yourself as another statistic in incarceration rates. We're going to be talking about this when I dive deep into the criminal justice system. Um, but getting back to my point, let's just talk about criminal justice on its own as an institution that is singularly responsible for producing these kinds of racialized outcomes. Okay. This is an institution that is producing disadvantage. Okay. Now, how is it producing that disadvantage? Well, part of it might be that the people who belong to that institution have like conscious hate against the people they are marginalizing. Now, this can be true, but this is not necessarily the case when we're talking about institutional racism. When we're talking about institutional racism, we're talking about the policies of that institution, the practices of that institution, the norms, either the culture norms, the political norms, the bureaucratic norms that are ultimately producing racialized disadvantage here. Okay. That is what it means to discuss institutional racism in this way. Okay. So just a little more abstract. Yes, people are facilitating what policies are getting run, what practices and how those practices are getting run, what constitutes an institutional norm. Yes, people are kind of enforcing those things. So institutional racism is still in some way connected to individual racism, but in this regard, it is just a little more conceptually abstract, is that we are talking about racism that is produced by ideas, by policies, by behaviors that are standardized in that institution and are not necessarily a reflection of any individual's personal belief. Okay. So there are key characteristics of institutional racism. First of all, like I literally just said this, it is not necessarily dependent on an individual's like intentions or their beliefs. Okay. It's dependent on a more abstract nature, those norms, those procedures, those policies. And those policies are what are perpetuating the inequality. It could be that in the context of criminal justice, at one point in time, a president of the United States decided to militarize the police and then concentrate them in black and brown neighborhoods, while places like Beverly Hills, which are majority white and Asian, barely have any police running through the neighborhoods at all. And so what happens is, whether a person is guilty or not, those police officers, by virtue of being law enforcement, are then enforcing the law based on the policies that politicians passed. And then the ways that they enforce those laws are being disproportionately enforced in these black and brown neighborhoods. That then leads to a disproportionate outcome of policing in these black and brown neighborhoods, then increases incarceration rates in these black and brown neighborhoods, right? Okay. And so that's going to perpetuate inequality. It's going to reinforce the inequality, and it is a given institution. It doesn't have to just be criminal justice. It could be race pattern disparities produced in some kind of academic system. It could be race pattern disparities produced in healthcare or in housing. It is that when we're talking about institutional racism, we're talking about a singular institute being responsible for its own production of racialized disadvantage. Okay. So the mechanisms of institutional racism are going to be, sometimes they are discriminatory policies that are very explicit. Sometimes they are discriminatory policies that are implicit. So I'll give you an example. This is a real world example where uh, Donald Trump wants to get rid of all of the quote unquote illegals in the country. And so passes a law, passes an executive order where he never explicitly says we're targeting Spanish speaking populations. All he said was we're getting illegal immigrants out of the country. And then he happened to call Mexico rapists and killers, right? Okay, so now in the enforcement of that policy, who is ICE targeting? Who are they mainly targeting? It's kind of implicit in the ways that they're enforcing this policy that they are then disproportionately targeting Spanish speaking communities when there are lots of white people, European immigrants, white passing immigrants throughout the country who have overstayed their visas and they know that they're perfectly fine because nobody's looking for them because they're white. Okay. So institutional racism or a mechanism of institutional racism is also going to mean that you are creating biased outcomes. You're creating unequal access. Okay. And so on that basis, like I said, it is a single institution being responsible for how it produces race pattern disparities entirely on its own. Okay. Then we get just a little more abstract where we're talking about structural racism. Where structural racism, we are talking about how each of these institutions, it could be housing and education and criminal justice and healthcare and all of these things, how it creates a ripple effect. The disadvantage, okay? It is how one form of institutional racism is interacting with another form of institutional racism from another institution that is then perpetuating and reinforcing inequality. That you then have racial inequality in housing, right? Let's say, I'll just give you this hypothetical example. The pathway doesn't necessarily need to be in this order. It's not necessarily in this order, but it's just for the sake of simplicity and for the example. Let's say we have racial inequality in housing. You have a three-person family that lives in a one-bedroom apartment compared to a three-person family that lives in a three-bedroom, two-bedroom house or bathroom house. Okay. Now, um, we could call that just by comparison housing inequality, right? The family is comparable, but they live in a different housing condition. So now the student who lives in the apartment with his family has to perform well academically, but he lives next door to neighbors who are constantly fighting, constantly yelling, constantly arguing. There's drugs outside of the home. There's crime outside of the home. The community is not necessarily safe for a child to play in. When in comparison, the child that grows up in the three-bedroom, two-bathroom home has plenty of space, has a front yard, has green space in their neighborhood. There's a nice green park. There's no trash anywhere. There's barely any police. There's no crack addicts or drug addicts or anything like that. By comparison, how does living in this environment affect their academic outcomes? So that racial inequality in housing then creates racial inequality in academic performance. And then let's say the student that lived in that apartment in that shitty neighborhood didn't score well and didn't get into college. And so because they didn't get into college, they didn't get access to that six-figure paying salary, that six-figure position or that six-figure job, that lucrative position that would have launched them into a position of stability in comparison to a well-supported child who was supported all throughout their lives, ended up getting that college admission, and in getting that college admission, they graduated. They qualified for that lucrative salary position. Okay, and so then the differentials in what these two individuals have accomplished academically then shows up in their employment opportunities. And then that differential not only shows up in their employment opportunities, it also then shows up in the wealth that they comparatively accumulate, right? Okay. So structural racism, we're then talking about how housing inequality creates inequality in education, which then creates inequality in employment, which then creates inequality in wealth, which then reinforces inequality in housing, reinforcing inequality in education, reinforcing inequality in employment opportunities, and so on and so forth. And like I said, It doesn't necessarily have to go in that specific order, but this is an example where now institutional racism in a more comprehensive context is creating like a ripple effect. Okay. So structural racism is a little more abstract in this regard because now we're not just talking about a singular institution, but we're talking about multiple institutions creating an interwoven effect in which the racism is operating collectively rather than in isolation. And that the racism a person may experience in the context of their lives is so pervasive that it's essentially everywhere. They wake up in the morning, they go out, they have to ride the bus. That's a form of racism they're experiencing. They get to work a little bit late because the bus was late, because it took too long to pick up other people. That's a form of racism. Then they get to work, they're making a low wage. That low wage, by comparison to the jackass who is making, $5 million every 15 seconds or something like that, that's a form of racism. We're talking about interconnected. I hate to use the term systems here, but for the sake of simplicity, interconnected systems, right? And there is a historical legacy. What we're talking about, this ripple effect, also is characterized by a historical legacy. Excuse me. It's characterized by centuries of racial discrimination, going all the way back to slave codes, to segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, redlining, okay, which then influence modern outcomes, okay? So the mechanisms of structural racism that we're describing here are cumulative disadvantage. We're talking about reinforcing racial dynamics. We're talking about the normalization of inequality. Inequality being so normalized that that's just how it is. That's how society is. Okay. That this is the way society functions, and these are the norms that other people wish to kind of protect and insulate. I might go about a few minutes over, but I'm almost done. I'm getting there. I promise. I really am getting there. Um, and this is where we get to systemic racism, where forgive the bracket for just a second. I forgot to get the bracket in the animation thing. But systemic racism, what we're describing with systemic racism is everything together. We're talking about structural racism. We're talking about institutional racism. We're talking about individual racism. There is a kind of fluid continuity between the two, between all three of these forms of racism that we're describing here. That the pyramid kind of seals itself here as one broader whole. That what we're describing as a system, think about the word system. We're talking about multiple parts that work together to produce an outcome. And it's happening at the individual scale, and it's happening at the most macro scale too. Okay. And that comprehensively, all of these things are simultaneously working together to produce racial inequality. Okay. So when we're talking about systemic racism, we're talking about all facets of racism in the ways that it operates in the context of producing racial inequality. Okay. And so key characteristics of systemic racism are going to be like, first of all, it's just widespread. It doesn't matter if it's a person's beliefs. It doesn't matter if it's policies. It's literally those things and everywhere in between. It is in all sectors of society. Excuse me. And it is going to persist through time. And that, in one sense, you could say the racial inequality that is produced by one institution is dependent on the racial inequality that is produced from another institution that is then dependent on the racial inequality that is produced from another institution. That in order for a prison, the prison industrial complex, to make billions of dollars, it can't just exist in isolation and in disproportionately incarcerating a specific kind of person, but that it is fundamentally dependent on the criminal justice system disproportionately policing and then incarcerating a specific kind of person, which is in itself dependent on politicians creating laws that can be disproportionately applied. or unequally enforced, which is then dependent on, you get my meaning, you catch my drift. It's that there is a kind of institutional interdependence, and it doesn't necessarily require conscious hate from everybody who's a part of it. Okay. It just so happens to be that our social norms, our cultural norms have been developed around the production of inequality in this context. And because it is around the production of inequality in this context, it doesn't really require intent at all. And we're all a fundamental part of this. You can see then how it starts to beg the question, well, it is possible to end it, so how? And that's where I'm getting. Hold on with me, stick with me just a little bit longer. So the mechanisms the mechanisms of systemic racism are essentially the mechanisms of structural racism, institutional racism, and individual racism combined. Not only are we talking about discriminatory policies, beliefs, or acts, but we're talking about a little bit more abstract resource disparities. That there is an unequal distribution of resources based on race in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of educational funding, in terms of legal representation, right? And that there is a legal framework that is reinforcing the sustain of the production of these outcomes. Okay. We're talking about policies that perpetuate inequality, but also laws too. And they don't necessarily have to be racially overt in order for those laws to be enforced in a racially disproportionate way. Okay. And so this is where we get to the concept of critical race theory. Okay. Critical race theory, the basic premise is that racism is influencing everything in society. I draw a circle around the pyramid here because the circle implies that not only does it include systemic racism, but it also includes the things that don't directly appear to have anything to do with racism at all. You can always find a racist ontology in anything you observe if you look close enough, if you look hard enough, for which critical race theory is then examining how that is happening. Okay. So critical race theory first started off as like a legal framework or an intellectual framework that observes how laws and legal institutions are sustaining the production of racial inequality. But critical race theory has kind of grown a lot, and it's expanded a lot since then. I included a resource in this week's resource post. You can find it on the Patreon. If you're watching this video after it's been recorded, then you probably already have access to it. But it's there. It's there for you to observe. And so what I essentially want to say here is critical race theory has four sort of central tenets of the ways that it sees racism. Okay. The first is that it observes racism as a social construct. It acknowledges that race is not a biologically valid concept. So we are looking at the function of racism in a social realm, in the social realm. But interestingly enough, because racism is so pervasive in all aspects of society, in all aspects of life, including those things that are not directly connected to race or those things that we don't observe to be directly connected to race, it sees racism as normal. Okay. Now, notice that I did not say it sees bigotry and prejudice as normal. Okay. When you're talking about racism through the lens of critical race theory, we are not just talking about bigotry and prejudice. We're talking about something a lot more expansive than that, than just that. But because it is so pervasive, it's almost as if it's a normal aspect of society. Please keep that in mind because in the slides to come, I'm going to be explaining this, and I really want you to understand what I mean when I say everybody is racist, because I'm not saying everybody is bigoted and prejudiced. Okay. Critical race theory also sees that racism is interacting with other dimensions of identity too. That racism can intersect with gender or sex. Racism can intersect with sexual orientation. Racism can intersect with religion. and on and on and on. But more importantly, because we are looking at a comprehensive theoretical framework around the context of racism, critical race theory sees racism as predictive. Now, I can't go into too much detail on this, but I would encourage, if you would like to see the context for what I mean when I say it sees racism as predictive, look up interest convergence. Okay. If you look up the meaning of interest convergence, you can certainly see how then racism becomes predictive in a theoretical way. Okay. So in essence, then, with critical race theory, as we are trying to expand our academic and scientific assessment of racism, the goal then is to model racism. How's about we develop a scientific model of racism that allows us to identify its flaws and its weak points, that allows us to then disrupt and dismantle it, and disrupt and dismantle it with scientific efficacy, right? In a way that cannot be resisted. Okay, because this is how you cultivate fair, just, and equal society. So critical race theory would kind of help us to do that, or at least the foundations would help us to do that. But that brings us back to what we truly need to mean when we talk about racism. And this is where I would like to introduce to you what I would say racism needs to be redefined. Okay. The layperson definition of racism is that it encompasses both prejudice and discrimination, or the practice of treating people differently on the basis of their race. I don't think this is useful, and I will tell you why. I think I already did tell you why. The reason is because how do I identify the scientifically effective solutions to disrupting the production of race pattern disparities if all I have to go on is prejudice and discrimination? I can't. However, hear me out. If we reconceptualize racism to a more neutral definition, we might actually be able to develop the intervention or the solution to many of the problems embedded in what we traditionally associate with racism. And here is how it goes. We would need to redefine racism to the ability to distinguish and categorize people based on a generally agreed upon understanding of race. And the reason is because now racism is not positioned solely as bigotry and prejudice, but now it is a neutral capacity from which our ability to see and distinguish people on the basis of racial difference can characterize the morality of their behavior, the morality of their beliefs, the morality of their actions, and the downstream consequences. In this theoretical framework, here's what I'm looking at here. Work with my definition. My definition of racism being just the ability to see and distinguish people on the basis of visible difference based on a generally agreed upon framework of race. From there, we have a form of benign racism. This would be like, yes, I am a black man, and today I went to the beach with my family, and I saw a white family that was there, and they looked lovely, and they looked like they were having a great time. I am able to acknowledge that there is racial difference among these people, but I'm not producing disadvantage. I'm not producing any kind of uh, advantage in any way, but my ability to see and acknowledge their race, to acknowledge anything that is technically racist. I'll give you another example if you don't believe me. My wife and I, when we were living in Seattle, we used to go to a Vons store that was really close by an Ethiopian community. Now, my wife, on the outside, lots of Ethiopian people assume that she's Ethiopian. So when we would go to this particular, I think it was Safeway, not Vons, but either way, we were going to the grocery store. Ethiopian people would walk up to her and just start talking to her in Amharic, in their language, and she wouldn't understand them at all. And then they would look at her like, how does this person not speak her own language? What's wrong with her? How does she live in this Ethiopian community and she doesn't speak Amharic? That doesn't even make any sense. They would literally look at her like something was wrong with her. My wife isn't Ethiopian. She is Filipino and Caribbean, who happens to look Filipino. or it happens to look Ethiopian. Well, how is it that all of these Ethiopian people are like making the same assumption about this person? It's because they are using racism to profile this person and to make the assumption that she is something that she is not. Now, in this context, it's a form of benign racism that doesn't disrupt the continuity of my wife's life. It doesn't advance her life in any way. It's kind of benign. And so this is what I mean when I say racism then exists on a kind of moral spectrum. You have to look at the moral context for which this definition has the capacity to produce disadvantage. It has the capacity to produce systems of oppression, which I would characterize as traditional racism. This is the society that we currently live in. Our society is calibrated towards the red end of this spectrum here, where white supremacy is kind of firmly rooted somewhere on the red side, right? You have individual forms of traditional racism, which only sees like maybe four, maybe five different racial groups and seeks to treat them or categorize them differently. You have institutional racism that is responsible for the production of race pattern disparities, right? In this context, our culture is calibrated towards the production of racial inequality. Okay. I would characterize that as unethical forms of racism. On the opposite end, though, now we can start theorizing about what the solution is to reversing the damage. And reversing the damage, believe it or not, the solution to fixing much of the damage from traditional forms of racism is anti racism. Because in the context of anti racism, now we are talking about using the very same system of racism that everybody else is using, but we're talking about the reduction of racial disparities. The reduction of race pattern disparities is literally just cultivating equality. That truly fair, just, and equal society that we all say we want to live in, well, guess what? Racism is going to be a fundamental part of that solution, right? If racism produced all of this disadvantage, racism is going to be responsible for fixing it too. And so this is where we get to, we have to be very intentional about our racism. We cannot end racism. That's not something that just goes away. It's something that has to be actively leveraged. And I'll tell you how. Here's how, when you think about racism as just prejudice, how it reveals your areas of limitation. I often ask my students this question of like, okay, racism is bigotry and prejudice. So now what is the opposite of microaggression? If we know microaggression exists somewhere in the in between the gray and red on the spectrum I just showed you in the last slide, well, then what's the opposite of microaggression? And usually people struggle to come up with the answer. If you've been watching my reels, then you know the answer. The answer is micro compassion in a racialized context. What does micro compassion look like in a racialized context? And can you use your imagination just like you can imagine microaggression in a racialized context? Do you see how the moment we reconceptualize racism as a neutral capacity, it isn't just purely all of the bullshit on the red side, but it can be a neutral capacity. Now we have the ability to start thinking about how we can fix society, how we can cement equality in the world around us, how we can create a more fair, just, and inclusive society for all. We can't do that if we just talk about racism as purely being bigotry and prejudice, because you can't end something like that. You cannot end something like that. It instead becomes about how you apply it. It becomes how you use your racism. So now I then start encouraging you to think more constructively and I want to say effect oriented here. What does institutional anti-racism look like? What does systemic anti-racism look like? And how can we recalibrate American society to an anti-racist center where we are now calibrated towards durable, measurable, observable equality? And if some group happens to show up in a way in which they are being disproportionately disaffected, how can we develop policies of intervention that seek to help those individuals? Don't you want to live in a fair, just, and equal society? Okay, well, then what you need to understand is end racism is not useful to us getting there. You can't end something like that. And because we are all a fundamental part of cultivating the solution based on this redefinition, this reconceptualization of racism that I am positioning to you, that I'm about to submit for evaluation in a scientific manuscript fairly soon here, it means that everybody is racist. And we can't end racism. We all have a part to play. How are we collectively using our racism? We cannot learn how to heal from the destruction of a traditionally racist society if we can only imagine racism as being bigotry and prejudice. It can be bigotry and prejudice, but it can also be a form of restorative justice too. And we need to reconceptualize it in that way if we want to have scientifically meaningful and effective solutions to intervening, disrupting, and dismantling the production of systemic oppression in American society. Do you get that? Okay. I wanna wrap up here because I want to get to questions. Maybe people have questions or something like that. But I want to ask this question because I always have to do this. Is I'm not advocating for ethical bigotry and prejudice. I am advocating for ethical application of race consciousness and racial awareness. Is how do you distinguish ethical racism from unethical? That is going to be history. History will show you where we need to concentrate, giving a certain group of people selective advantages that they would not otherwise have. That if this country was founded on slavery for 400 years and we never gave those disaffected people or their descendants restitution, that part of the solution is giving them restitution. That if we are going to fundamentally try to break our democracy through gerrymandering, voter suppression, and these kinds of things, we would also then need to disproportionately target those groups of people that are being disaffected and then give them access to participating in democracy. Do you see how you can then develop restorative solutions? The moment you can concede that racism is not just bigotry and prejudice, suddenly all of the solutions start popping up like magic. It becomes very clear how you can effectively reduce the production of race pattern disparities in society, and it doesn't involve being more bigoted. It involves going, I see this group of people. I see that that group of people is being disaffected and they are being disaffected on the basis of their race. So I'm going to intervene on the basis of their race. I'm going to advocate for them on the basis of their race. I'm going to access political power that gives all of us the ability to work in their favor so that we can cultivate a more fair, just, and inclusive society for all. Wasn't it Martin Luther King who said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere? Okay, so now we see racial injustice, and on the basis of the racial injustice that we see, how can we engage in racial justice for that very same disaffected group? It doesn't have to just be Black people. It could be Palestinians. It could be the Jews that were being persecuted during the Holocaust. It could be the group of people that are being marginalized in Sudan. Do you see how the moment you are able to leverage your racism to go, yes, I see that other group of people on the basis of their race or what we're calling their race, and I am going to do what I can to help them on the basis of that race so that we can cultivate a more fair, just, and inclusive and equal society for all of us. Suddenly, we now have the solution to being able to dismantle all of the fucked up bullshit that we've been looking at for centuries. But it requires you to concede that racism has to be reconceptualized. You have to stop thinking that racism is just bigotry and prejudice. It isn't. Okay? And so in expanding critical race theory here, what I am advocating for is what I am saying here complements the expansion of critical race theory, it complements critical race theory, is that we should start looking at racism and leveraging racism as normal. We all see differences. We all view those differences. We don't all identify the same way. I am not saying bigotry and prejudice should be normal. I'm saying we need to understand that racism actually really is normal, and it's okay for us to use racism as a tool for restorative justice in the exact same way that racism is being used as a tool for destruction and division, right? And so in this context, then I am saying that we need to start looking at racism and race through a social ecological framework as a form of social ecology. Stop thinking about it as just bigotry and start looking at how racism truly functions in society in a scientifically meaningful context. Last slide here, and then we'll jump to questions. Okay. So here, right, you have all of these different claims, and I see these claims on my Instagram page all the time. Oh, racism doesn't exist. Oh, systemic racism doesn't exist. Oh, white supremacy doesn't exist. I saw that a lot in the Amanda Seales uh, 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 debate. Black people can't be racist. Well, not everybody is racist. No, no, no. Yeah, when you think about racism as purely being bigotry and prejudice, maybe some of these statements make sense to you. But I would say that I am starting to develop a new academic field called racism ecology. It's conceptual, but work with me here. And through a racism ecology lens, in order for any of these statements to be true, all of these conditions must be met. These are principles here. In order for, let's just take an example. Racism doesn't exist. In order for that to be true, there cannot be socially constructed racial categories. Those don't exist. In order for that statement to be true, there can be no differential access to power or resources. In order for the statement, racism doesn't exist to be true, there can be no implicit bias. There can be no explicit bias. There can be no racially disparate outcomes. There can be no historical inheritance of racial inequality. There can be no racial segregation. And everybody is race neutral. Everybody is racialized in exactly the same way. Do you see how in order for a statement like racism doesn't exist or systemic racism doesn't exist, in order for that to be true, these ecological factors or ecological principles must be met. And if you cannot meet even one of those, then it would mean that everybody is racist. Notice I did not say everybody is bigoted and prejudiced. You can be racist without being bigoted and prejudiced. Everybody is racist. You cannot end racism. It is only about how you deal with it. More importantly, in these principles here, the list of principles that we have here, I am showing you that this is how racism functions in society. Racism functions because there are socially constructed racial categories. Racism functions because there is differential access to power and resources. Racism functions because there is implicit and explicit bias. Racism functions because there are racially disparate outcomes. Racism exists because there are historical patterns of inherited inequality. Racism exists because there is racial segregation. There has been racial segregation. The most racially segregated places in America are still barbershops and churches. And nobody is race neutral. So because nobody is race neutral, everybody is racist. Do you see how that works? And the moment you can truly understand that everybody is racist, everybody has a role to play, racism is not just bigotry and prejudice, suddenly now we can easily see what the solutions to solving all of this is. The problem to addressing Charlie Kirk and the spread of his anti-black racism, his anti other xenophobic rhetoric, Suddenly now we know what the solution is. The solution to addressing Donald Trump, you know what the solution is. And no, I'm not advocating for violence or anything. I'm talking about a scientifically meaningful way to develop methods of intervention. Is the same way this person is using political power to racialize other people toward a negative outcome is the exact same way that the person who steps in right after him can use their political power to develop racialized interventions with the goal of measurable equality. So we can bring all of those race pattern disparities to a point of convergence in their own respective contexts, thereby cultivating equality in society. I'm going to take questions now. I don't know if anyone is in here, anyone is watching, but I'm recording, so I'm still doing this lecture anyway. I want to open up the floor for questions. Let's see if we can get. I want to give. Okay, to the folks in the chat, you have the ability to unmute yourself and to start your video if you so choose. And then I am also going to, I want to have my Instagram chat open so that I can answer questions there. Hi.
Hello. I was wondering if you could go back to the health disparities slide.
Yeah, hold on one second. I need to change my audio settings so that uh, I can hear you through my headphones and not through. Just give me one second. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Technical difficulties. Um, okay, I can't figure it out. I will go back to that slide. Let's go back there. Oh, here we go. Let's see. We're going to go all the way back to health disparities. Come on, almost there. Okay, here we go. All right. Yeah. Oh, I encourage you and other people to. Yeah. So, did you have a question about this? Did you want to know what the explanation was?
Yeah, I wanted you to go into it a bit more if you could. And also one of the things, because I know you've listed some possible factors into this, and I was also just curious about how generational trauma plays into this as well, if
Yeah.
you had
Yeah.
any.
Sure. So, okay. So, for those of you who are just listening, you don't have you don't you're not seeing the screen. We are looking at a graph of life expectancy at birth with different life expectancies corresponding to race. And what we're observing is the graph goes from the year 2000 to the year 2019. And we see that Asian Pacific Islanders are on top. Latinos are just below them. There's no overlap. You have white people that are on par with the total average, but there's still no overlap. And then black people are just above American Indian and Alaska Natives, who are at the bottom, and there's slight overlap around 2006 or so, but then they separate again. And so this is a graph in which white people are not actually on top here. Like white people are in better, inherently better positions than others in the other graphs that we looked at. And so one of the questions around this is why is that? Why is it that white people appear to have shorter life expectancy when compared to Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders? So there's a few things to parse out. Okay, the first is okay. All of these examples are not necessarily the answer more than it's just speculation. Okay, the two groups on top, Asian Pacific Islanders and Latinos, they, for what we know, have something in common that white, black, and American Indians do not. Do you want to take a guess as to what that is culturally? Are you there?
I
Oh,
am.
Oh yeah.
I'm just
Oh,
thinking.
sorry. I'm gonna have a conversation with you because that's what this is. Do you want to take a guess as to what might be going on culturally for Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders that is not necessarily going on for white, black, and American Indians?
I think the only thing that's coming to mind that I don't necessarily think is correct, all I can think about, because I grew up in Arizona, so I know a lot of the Latino community is very big on community and family, and I
Mhm.
don't know if that's something that's playing a factor into that.
Okay. Yes, that is literally what I'm getting at. Is
Oh,
that
good.
these groups tend to be more communal and community oriented and supportive than white, black, and American Indian or Alaska Native. And part of that is in the politics of American society, disconnected from Europe, disconnected from Africa. We have a norm of rugged individualism in our culture, or in our respective cultures, that is not necessarily the case in Asian Pacific Islander or Latino communities. Okay. That's one speculation. The other speculation is Latinos, in my opinion, one of the reasons why American Indian has such a wide variation, that you don't necessarily see for these other groups is because there is technically no functional difference between Latinos and American Indians other than who they were colonized by,
Hmm.
right? What was the language of the colonizer who colonized them? So, in the case of what we call Latino, it was the people from Spain. In the case of American Indians, it was English speakers, right? So, that being the only difference, these people are actually native. Now, how were they treated differently on the basis of their difference to Europeans? American Indians were displaced. They experienced a large genocide, right? They experienced systemic disadvantage that would place them down below in a way that Latinos, by comparison, the Latino, what we call quote unquote Latino community, I hate using this term, um, uh, but the Latino community is they're all comprised of Spanish speakers that are mostly native
Hmm.
and don't have the same kinds of disadvantage, disproportionate genocide or history of genocide or the experience of genocide that American Indians do. In terms of Asian Pacific Islanders, many of them that come to the US are coming to the US as immigrants, and they're coming from countries where they don't have a history of extreme disadvantage that is comparable to African American slavery or American Indian genocide. And so there's an interesting hypothesis in a book written by Jonathan Metzl, called Dying from Whiteness, in which he hypothesizes that like white racism is not, it doesn't even help white people. It actually also hurts and harms them too. And so, somewhere in the middle of that all, we might be seeing that in terms of life expectancy, being more community supportive, community oriented might reinforce better health outcomes and therefore longevity in a way that rugged individualism does not. Does that at least provide a substantive answer for you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and then in addition to that, you have the physiologic or physical pathway, right? The physical pathway is black people, brown people are constantly in a state of stress, constantly in like fight or flight mode, constantly experiencing mental and emotional wear and tear. And then that triggers a kind of somatic imbalance that imposes wear and tear on their health and well-being, and then ultimately increases their likelihood for chronic health diseases. Maybe that's hypertension, maybe that's stroke, maybe that's heart disease, diabetes, these kinds of things, that then increases their likelihood to die or not live as long in comparison to people who do not have a lifelong stressful experience in the pervasive ways that racism or anti-black and brown racism shows up for them. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. Okay. Great question. Thank you for asking about that again. Do you have any other questions?
No, just one of the things that it just got me thinking about. Are you familiar with like adverse child experiences, like
Yeah,
ACEs and stuff like
yeah,
that? That
ACEs,
was one of
yes.
the other things that I was thinking about kind of in terms of this, because I know kind of in general, like the Latino population, I want to say is like their scores are usually about twice as high as the white population. So it's
Yeah,
interesting that in this health disparities chart, they're placed higher than white population. So
yeah.
it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, but like I said, there's also that function of communalism
Yeah.
too. It's impossible that that could be acting as a buffer. Now, can we say with 100% certainty that that's what's going on? Absolutely not. But in a scientifically meaningful space where we're at least speculating about this, it tends to be the case that people, groups of people that are more community oriented and community supportive, tend to have better health outcomes. And that's just the case across the world, right? So
Absolutely.
that's entirely possible. Thank you for your question, Monica.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have I have lots of comments in the Instagram feed, so I'm going to read a few. Monica, if you want to have a discussion with me about anything that's said here, you're welcome to jump in, but no pressure. What are some useful tips to reclaim a level of hopelessness and support a greater cause for change? I'm currently in the education phase, but would love advice on more tangible solutions. This is what I'm talking about. Jalen, I hope you're still here and you're listening to the answer. This is what I'm talking about when I say useful tips for reclaiming hope is going to look like we see that, like, I don't know, negative forms of racism are absolutely destroying society. And it's having negative consequences on the health and well-being of others. And if we want to put a stop to that, if we want to interrupt, if we want to intervene, we need to start thinking about the scientifically critical and effective ways at intervening. We can't just be led by our emotions. We can't just be led by a desire to end racism, because when you unpack that, what the hell does that actually mean? When you start leaning into, how's about we scientifically understand this? Let's develop a model that allows us to not only see where the problem exists, but identify the solutions. It's so effective at identifying the solutions that you begin to see there are no other solutions. This is the most effective one. And while I am still in the phase, I'm still working on a paper. I'm accommodating feedback from faculty in my department. But I am trying to submit a paper on this topic to a peer of scientific minded reviewers. Is that we really need to reconceptualize racism, and we need to stop talking about it as just being bigotry and prejudice, because the moment we do, all of the solutions become painfully clear. Now it's, wow, okay, we cannot get rid of racism. It's just about how we use it. So now start asking yourself, how is Charlie Kirk using his racism? How is Donald Trump using his racism? How can I use my racism in a way that undermines theirs? Do you get it? And then it starts being, I see these disaffected populations. I'm going to be their ally. I want to live in a fair, just, and equal America. And no, racism isn't just bigotry and prejudice. It's not something that I can get rid of. It's a tool that I can use just as much as it is a weapon. And I can use it to cultivate a fair, just, and equal society. And as long as people convince you that you cannot use racism in this way, we stay stuck here. We stay stuck with Charlie Kirk having millions of followers and tons of supporters for a platform of bigotry and hate and fascism. And we're stuck with that because we never learned that racism isn't just sitting next to Charlie Kirk and letting Kirk pilot the plane. Okay? So identifying solutions means truly asking yourself, face your own racism. Don't try to control the racism of other people. Face your own racism here and say, what am I doing with my racism? Am I doing anything meaningful? Am I doing anything constructive? Am I doing anything destructive? What can I do in my limited capacity using my racism to make a positive difference? A positive difference that is working towards uh, 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 bringing many of these race pattern disparities to a point of convergence. In the context of life expectancy, we're looking at this graph of life expectancy. I am not talking about bringing Asian Pacific Islanders and Latinos down to the average. Absolutely not. Instead, I'm talking about how we can elevate those marginalized populations and including white people too. What do we need to do to elevate people's life expectancy to a point where we can converge where Asian Pacific Islanders are? What would that look like? Now that we're asking this question, we can start entertaining the possible variables that would give us the answer. And maybe being more community oriented, being more community supportive, not just for Black people, but for everybody in a way that is supportive of everyone's success. What does that look like? And when you start reflecting on racism in this way, I promise you, the solutions start showing up. It stops feeling like you're looking for a light switch in the dark. It's just that you have to understand, you have to expand your understanding of racism. In the same way, I would say it's the same thing for when people learned that the earth is round and not flat, when people learned that Pluto was not a planet. You have to relearn, unlearn what you were told about racism and relearn that it can be bigotry and prejudice. It can be systems of oppression, but it can also be leveraged for good. And there's nothing we can do to get rid of it. So, how can we use it in a way that sustains meaningful, positive change? And when everyone starts asking that where they are, start addressing the racism where you are in your proximity. Don't make it about other people. Don't make it about the racism that's out there somewhere. Don't try to yield, assert influence on, oh, well, the racism is out there and there's nothing I can do about it. That is a lie. It's your racism. Deal with your own racism. What can you do with your racism to create the America we all say we want to live in? Racism is a part of that solution. And no, I am not saying bigotry and prejudice are a part of that solution. So you have to learn the nuance there. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. Next question. Um, I'm looking for a question. I see lots of comments. Lots of comments here. Does your Patreon include full lectures? Yes. I am currently recording this lecture right now. So this one will be posted afterwards. But the first week, last week's video is available, and there's a YouTube link. You'll have to look through my post to find it. So would an example of this be with the Japanese and Middle Eastern people during 9/11? Rigo 4973. I'm not sure what you mean by this question. You'll have to expand just a little bit. I'm going to scroll up just a little bit. I'll come down to the live feed. I just want to see if I can find any other questions. You do know Spain is a part of. Oh, they're asking somebody else. I can't find any questions. Does anyone want to ask a question? Ask a question about what we talked about. Um, okay, love your take on racism. Very refreshing. Thank you so much. I'm assuming your name is Jackie. Please forgive me if I've butchered it. Yes, this is a take on racism because I have spent years studying racism, reading about racism, trying to develop solutions, and I don't know where I got the idea from, but it happened to do with when you get to the point where you study something so much that you understand it inside and out, it starts to become very clear how it works. And when you understand how it works, then it makes it so that you can understand what its weaknesses are. And so I've come to learn that identifying the weakness of what we call racism in layperson society is we're kind of like handicapping ourselves as a collective society. And the way that we're handicapping ourselves is that we see racism as just being bigotry and prejudice. And because we only see racism as bigotry and prejudice, it makes it impossible to think about what the solutions are. So let's say I have been that person who has been racist. At one point in my life, I have said racist things, I have said bigoted things, and I truly did mean them. If I can reflect on that, if I can acknowledge it, then that means that I'm racist. I'm racist. I just heard somebody on the bus say something racist. I just heard my boss say something racist. I just heard the president of the United States say something racist. Okay, so maybe everybody's racist. All right, what does that look like? Everybody's racist. Well, there are some forms of racism that aren't bigotry and prejudice. I don't know if you've ever seen the Rush Hour movies. They're on Netflix. Go watch them. They're amazing. They're incredible. They're phenomenal. They're incredibly racist. Okay, racism isn't all just bigotry and prejudice. So where does that lead us? Okay, let's start thinking about this a little bit more broadly. Maybe racism isn't just bigotry and prejudice. Maybe it's something else. Okay, how can we define racism in a neutral way? And then from that point on, it starts to lead to identifying solutions. And that's how I ended up there. Is once I started being able to examine racism in whatever ways it presented itself to me in my life, I could observe it, I could name it, I could see it, it started expanding my awareness for what racism actually is. And I have now come to the understanding that racism isn't just bigotry and prejudice. It can be, totally can be. It isn't just that. And so everybody's racist. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's just about how you're using your racism. And so there are lots of people that are using their racism for hurtful, harmful, destructive purposes. And so if they can use their racism in that way, maybe I can use my racism in a way that is more constructive and good. And no, that doesn't mean throwing around the N word because I want to help Black people, but it means, yeah, maybe part of the solution is giving Black people reparations because that's a form of racial justice and restoration. Does that make sense? Okay. Um, very interested in what you're saying. Oh yeah. For what you're saying, Danny, you would have to go back to the lecture. I'm in Q&A right now. I will be uploading the lecture tomorrow on YouTube, and then you can watch it at your own leisure. Um, I mean, what Japanese Americans did using their racism to help Middle Eastern Americans during 9/11. I am not familiar with this. If you would love to expand, I'd love to hear this. Please educate me. I'm sorry, I might have missed this. I heard from a YouTube Jubilee forum many young Black people speaking about Black on Black violence being a major issue for their communities. Is this racist? Yes, technically, anything to do with race, the topic of race, is racist. Does that make it bad? No, because we can talk about African American reparations. That's a form of racism. It's a form of racial selection. It's an anti-racist selection. Does that make it bad? No, but it is racist because it has to do with race, right? Now, on the Jubilee debate, I explain this in my videos on my reels. You can go to my reels. I've had DL Hughley started promoting me today. That was really nice. Thank you, DL Hughley. I really appreciate your support. Um, it is a form of racism. You have to understand, Black people are just as racist as everybody is because everybody's racist. And look at what those Black people are doing with their racism. They're doing the exact same things with their racism that white supremacists are, right? Somebody said, I used to say white people are either ignorantly racist or blatantly racist or both. I can add Black people to that as well. Well, I mean, yeah, technically, but I would say that it's important. It's important for you not to just target people and throw the label of racism. I am trying to get you to look at your own racism. Look at yourself. The only racism you're going to fix is yours. Okay. And so if you're going to be a part of the solution, if you're going to be someone who's a part of enacting restorative justice, it starts with what you can do. And with what you can do is what you have control over, which means start by looking at your own racism. Focus on yours. Don't focus on other Black people's, other white people's, other blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying you can't talk about them. I'm not saying you shouldn't talk about them. But I'm saying if you want effective solutions, that's part of the effective solution is going to be I need to look at my own racism. I need to admit that I am racist. I need to admit that I have a role to play in racism. And then from there, what does it look like moving forward? What does it look like? Okay. Thank you for joining, Jalen. I really appreciate it. If you want to jump into the chat here, uh, I'm trying to see where my video camera went to. Are you able to see me? Maybe
Yeah, I can see you.
oh, okay. Yeah, so do you have a question? You don't have to show yourself if you don't want to, but if you want to chime in and talk, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I had a quick question kind of building off the initial one I sent on Instagram. So pretty much currently I'm working in oil and gas, kind of giving like high level details, I guess. And navigating that space has been very interesting because everything that's happened recently with the elections and things like that, they have a lot of data points in regards to different demographics who have been impacted because I didn't realize this as I'm learning more about strategy and things like that in that field. They are really interested in the demographics of who voted for which politicians and things like that. Especially since they have PACs and things like that that directly kind of lobby for the betterment of that industry. And so one of the things I wanted to understand holistically, and you gave a good explanation, I never really considered as racism being a neutral tool pretty much. You get to wield it however you'd like, which is pretty interesting. But from that perspective, what are things that you can potentially start doing to be a better, I guess, user or wielder of your racism? Because, like, for me, what I'm kind of getting to understand, because I go to a church that's like Korean, pretty culturally like diverse and things like that. But unfortunately, due to that, they don't speak about hard issues. And one of the things I've already kind of started on my own is like a small subgroup of the church where we like listen to things like that, surrounded video with, I guess I forgot her name off the top of my head, but that whole situation. But how do you start to push against the complicity, like complicit ideologies, or as well as the fear that people harbor, and also those who might be physically hopeful? I think because a lot of people are willing to dismiss a lot of the harm that's done because they believe that one day they will become like Elon or whoever is rich at the time.
Yeah. That's a very loaded question. Not to be dismissive at
No
all.
worries.
And I'm gonna do my best to answer it, but I want to tell you it's a loaded question. I think it's context dependent. I can tell you that what I'm doing right now, that's what it looks like. It looks like educating people, getting people to understand and perhaps entertain the idea that they may in fact actually be racist. And that doesn't mean they're inherently bigoted and prejudiced, but that they do have a cognitive framework for being able to distinguish themselves from other people on the basis of that race, of their race, and that it triggers psychological processes that show up as implicit bias. It shows up as explicit bias. It can be verbal, and you need to start reflecting on how that looks for you, right? So now, in my role as an educator, I am trying to not only use my racial awareness and understanding to educate others about that, but perhaps for you in your career in politics, that looks like some other form of not only encouraging more racial awareness, but also restorative justice. Everything that I'm saying here, everything, all of the ideas that I am trying to promote here are oriented toward restorative justice. I could be that Charlie Kirk. I clearly I have a platform here and I'm embracing racism here. And I could use it and I could start saying the exact same things that Charlie Kirk is saying. Oh, black people look this way, black people do that, and oh, they're illegals and we need to kick them out and blah blah blah. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm saying no, we need to be advocating for Palestine because those people, especially those children, are starving and they need our help. No, we need to be advocating for the historically marginalized groups in American society because they need our help. The natives, the people who are the descendants of the natives of these lands, are currently being rounded up and then shipped over to Africa. Do you realize that? Maybe we need to start using our voice to speak up for them. Maybe some of us could start running for office and joining in. Get access to political power so you can use your racism in a politicized way that is oriented towards restorative justice, that doesn't seek to position one specific group above others, but instead is looking, it has an eye towards equality and cultivating equality in a fair and just society. Maybe that means, I don't know, maybe you're my point here is that it's context dependent. There isn't really a cookie cutter answer or a cookie cutter approach. It's largely dependent on in what capacity does your racism show up around you, and how can you use it as a tool for restorative justice? Does that make sense?
No, that makes total sense. And even now, I think I was listening to another creator on her YouTube video, and it basically kind of spoke to the idea of starting where you are, like being hopeful and not allowing the onslaught of information to kind of like distract you from doing anything.
Yes.
So even now, like I said, like I have my small group that we're starting to even have conversations about immigration and things like that at the church, because like at the end of the day, people are so scared to say anything. And so I think that's a good first step, and I appreciate everything that you're doing. But in line with the, I guess, navigating the corporate side, if there are situations like, for example, my boss, our previous boss, said like he's excited that his wife is excited for Trump's third term, and says things
Oh.
like the situation in regards to 2020 is way worse than what happened on Jan 6, and I'm his subordinate, and I'm in the cubicle with all my other coworkers as the only black person or black male, and
Mhm.
how do you navigate those conversations without
Mhm.
potentially, I mean, at the end of the day, I recognize that if I do speak out in those regards, that I put myself at risk of being fired or
Yep.
blackballed in
Yep.
that space.
Yep.
But
Yep.
is it worth the climb in those moments, because it doesn't seem to necessarily directly impact the hiring of more black people, if
Yeah.
anything?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say it is more like the Game of Thrones, right? It is be strategic, be political, play the politics game. Maybe you know that right now is not a good time, but you hold on to those values. And when you do get into a position of power and influence where you can make a conscientious difference, you can change the tone of discussion in moments like those, do so, right? It's about what you can do in the moment. Maybe this is not the moment right now for you to put all your chips on the table. But when you do, you will get there. I promise. I know you'll get there because I'm getting there in the continuity of the journey of my own life. When you do get there and then embrace it. But you're not there yet. So embrace it. What can you do with your racism right now that still allows you, that still sees you in an upward growth trajectory? And then when you get the opportunity and the power and the influence to go, no, we're going to start doing things different here. And here's how I'm calling the shots. And here's what we're doing. That's when you start turning those switches on. That's what Donald Trump did. Do you
Gotcha.
see how that works? That's what Elon Musk is doing. That's what literally anybody in any of these corporate settings. You're playing essentially a politics game until you get into the throne for yourself, and then you have the ability to make a difference. And some people are intentionally choosing destruction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Okay. So then what I'm saying to you is now they're not the only ones who are racist. And yes, they're the bigoted ones, they're the prejudiced ones, but you can also use your racism in the exact opposite way that they are too. It can also be a tool for constructive contribution. But it is, in order for you to see it this way, it requires you to stop seeing racism as just bigotry and prejudice. It isn't.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I had one last question. I talked a little bit in the Instagram about the neutrality of racism, like based off what you're saying. And if that's the
Mhm.
case, curiosity and empathy are kind of the opposites of bigotry and hatred. And so I guess my question is, would the content creator who kind of goes around New York asking questions across different diasporas from like food and culture and things like that. I don't know his name off the top of my head, but I'm assuming that you've probably seen him once or twice. He's even gone to like the Caribbean and stuff like that on different stories. Is that a format in which you would kind of agree that's a positive usage of racism?
So I will be honest and say I don't specifically know who you're talking about, but getting an idea from what you're describing, it would sound like it because he's giving a platform for different people from different walks of life and backgrounds to be able to share their humanity, correct?
Yeah, it's Nicholas Nuven. That's the guy's name. If you want to take a quick look.
Nicholas Nuven.
Nuvan.
Okay. Um, I'll check it out. I can't watch it right now. I
Yeah.
don't even follow him. So I'm going to follow him and I'm going to leave this page here so I can see a few of his videos. But I'm scrolling through and I see what's going on here. I would say this is the form of anthropology, just from what I see.
Oh, okay.
He's going around to different people. It seems to be very positive. It seems to be open-minded and curious. Yes, and I
Gotcha.
would say curiosity, even with bigotry. Sometimes you can kind of trip up bigotry just by being curious. What do you mean by that? Would you mind repeating that? Explain that to me because I don't understand it. Once a bigot has to explain the logic of their reasoning, usually that's when they're kind of embarrassed by what they're saying,
That's fair.
right? Yeah. And so yes, curiosity is a kind of antidote. Yeah. Lead with curiosity, and part of that curiosity means you don't have to have an agenda. I'm not necessarily saying you have to have a political agenda with a blah blah blah, but I'm just saying, yeah, lead with curiosity, and as long as you're oriented towards fairness, justice, equality, whatever contributions you make are going to lead you there. And yes, on the basis of race, sometimes that's going to be when you're the executive at the end of the table calling the shots and you're the only black person in that room, that is probably your moment to then go, I'm the only black person here and I don't want to be. Hey, can we get a trans person in here? Can we get a queer identifying person in here? What about a non-binary person? Can we get somebody who speaks this language that we don't have so we can reach out to this clientele? All of that diversity is going to make your company, your executive leadership stronger.
Yep.
You're adding tools to your box, adding tools to, I don't want to say your belt because it's not personal. You don't own anybody. But
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying here is you're adding tools to your arsenal to be more effective, whether that's in corporate leadership, whether that is in social leadership, whether that's in political leadership, by adding and concentrating that diversity around you in your own space. But it starts with, yeah, there's too many of this kind of person here. Could we diversify it a little bit?
Yep.
Right? Not, and obviously, again, it's context dependent. I'm not saying, we need more black people. What I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying is, we need more diversity here. Can we be intentional about that? The only people who are going to complain about that are the ones who don't want more diversity. You're not looking for white candidates, and this is racist. Yeah, that's kind of the point. Look at where the last set of procedures got us. Where are we? Look at where we're at. That
Yep.
was racist too. Look at where it got us. If you go right now, if you stick with me through these Sunday lectures, eventually I will get to talking about job or occupational distribution statistics, where we're looking at patterns of race by the distribution of occupation, whether you're a custodian or whether you're a manager or whether you're an executive or something like that. And the higher up you get, the whiter it gets. Well, in our current society, that's the norm. And for some reason, that's not racist. So a large number of white people have concentrated access to power, privilege, and influence that they are disproportionately denying to others. And
Mm-hmm.
somehow we say that's not racist. But when we start going, why don't we make things a little more fair and equal? And yes, we do need to be race conscious about it. And yes, we need to start diversifying in here a little bit more. Suddenly that's racist.
Yep.
But what we had before wasn't. That was racist too. So maybe, yeah, that's kind of the point. It's all racist. That's the reason. That's the point. The point is we need to be intentional about our racism because it is racist. But no, I'm not being bigoted and prejudiced. I'm just being racially conscious and I'm trying to make things better here. And here's how we can do so. Does that make sense?
That's super helpful. And I wanted to say one last thing to kind of workshopping with you in regards to what you said about the tool belt thing. Would you say a better framework for that is that we live in a global neighborhood and that instead of adding people to your tool belt, you're just adding a neighbor to the neighborhood or like to your respective?
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. Because I don't want to commodify people. I don't want to make
Yeah.
people like reduce people to objects. So please don't lose the meaning in the message. But
Mhm.
yes, you're adding a neighbor to the neighborhood.
Gotcha.
Yeah, You're adding, and what you don't want, what you want to be intentional about is I don't want to stigmatize racial isolation. I do think that, communities of people who look like one another is healthy to an extent, but I don't think that they should exist in isolation that has to be enforced, or those barriers have to be forcefully put there. Instead, what I think is we do need to be intentional in spaces of collaboration about saying we need people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, who are not like us. And that means that when we're in the hiring process and we're tasked with trying to select the next candidate for this role we're looking for, how's about we're intentional about hiring somebody that doesn't look like we do? Let's be intentional about that. Oh, it's racist. Yeah, but that's where the diversity is, right? Because anything where people are is racism is going to be there. So you can't get rid of it. The racism is going to be there whether you want it to be there or not. It's just about how you're using it. So are we using it to give more influence and power and privilege to more white people, or are we trying to move away from a white supremacist culture norm and toward a more fair, just, and inclusive one where people can actually be considered on the basis of their skills and not simply because they look, think, and act like the group of people who are interviewing them? Does that make sense?
That's perfectly clear, and I appreciate everything you're doing on Instagram and social media as well.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay, I want to answer one more question on the Instagram chat, and then we'll wrap up here. If your worldview can be shut down by a 5-year-old asking questions out of genuine curiosity, it's probably not a good worldview. Yeah, I agree. I agree. I would agree with you. I think if anything, I think to a 5-year-old, if I were to have conversations like this on a 5-year-old level, I don't have a problem making it that simple to understand. Is, it's a good thing when you have friends that don't look like you and they know things that you don't know, because it means then that you all work together and you can be more effective in how you work together. Who doesn't want that? Right? Okay. And so that's where we'll leave it. Thank you so much, Jalen and Monica, for joining me. I would love to have you back next week. Next week we are going to be talking about whiteness. I would actually love to have white people in the discussion for my discussion about whiteness. I would love to get your experiences, get your perspectives, correct me where I'm wrong, share with the people who are following on Instagram Live. Be a part of contributing to what I believe is something great. And I would love to have you there next week, and I hope to see you. Okay. Thank you so much for joining, and I will see you all next week. Take care.